Can a slinky walk down the ramp of the Guggenheim Museum? Coming up on Architecture CodeX.
Architecture CodeX. If you want to see more, subscribe.
Most of the time when I am covering a building for Architecture CodeX, I am perhaps introducing you to a building you did not know. But sometimes I am not only talking about a building you know, but one that you might have visited, such as the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum in New York City by Frank Lloyd Wright. I probably do not need to tell you how the white spiral form makes it distinctive from the outside, or how the interior space formed by that spiral and the skylight is perhaps the most amazing round room since the Pantheon. But I just did. And most people who visit it would agree. They are amazed and impressed with the interior space and see the exterior as a wonderfully different building form. They like it. Some might argue that one aspect of the museum's failure is people who visit the museum tend to remember the building more than they remember the art on the inside. I do not think Frank Lloyd Wright would see that as a failure. I doubt any architect wants to hear your building is too beautiful, please make it ugly, although that has happened, even to me. On the exterior, some critics said the form and color, more white than Wright would normally use, was disruptive of the New York City grid. My response would be, duh. It is disruptive because it's a special building, and a good city will have a characteristic pattern and form, but will allow some buildings to be more figural, to stand out. For example, Walter Gropius's Pan Am building, now the MetLife building, towered above the buildings along Park Avenue, purposely out of scale with those buildings at the time. So it visually terminated the avenue at Grand Central Terminal. In this way, it replaced the Helmsley Hotel, the hotel is still there, that presided over the Park Avenue the previous generation when the buildings were shorter. Both stood out because it was good for them to stand out. So the Guggenheim, being noticeable and different, is one of its attributes. And for the New York City grid purists, the Guggenheim is across the street from Central Park, a green superblock that is already disruptive of the grid. There are many critics of the building's inside, particularly among museum curators, who try to set up shows in the spiral space. While they appreciate the building, they feel they are fighting the architecture, and they often are. Wright's vision was rigid, and he did not build the kind of large, flexible spaces that museums prefer today. Much of Wright's rigid vision can be explained in the origins of the museum. It was designed to hold the non-objective art paintings of Solomon R. Guggenheim, who was a mining millionaire. His art collection shifted from the old masters to modern avant-garde art in the 1920s, inspired by friend Baroness Hilla von Rebe. Non-objective art was a term used to describe art that did not look like any particular object, so to speak, or a person or scene. In other words, the art was viewed subjectively and not objectively. For example, in his collection was Albert Glise's 1915 painting, Jazz. This art portrays a man, apparently, playing a guitar, or so we interpret as we see things subjectively through the hints the artist has painted. In the white circle, you see black strokes that could be fingers coming from the cuff of a sleeve. Is this a banjo or a guitar? There is a neck and painted strokes that could be frets, etc. Other shapes and our brain complete the image of the man in a black jacket with a white shirt, dark-skinned face, and a head with tall black hair. This, along with what might be called other cubist or modern art by the likes of Kandinsky, Picasso, and others, comprised Guggenheim's collection. Rebe also persuaded Guggenheim to hire Frank Lloyd Wright as the architect, and they started in 1943, and there were many design iterations and apparently 6 full sets of construction documents in order to get the design they eventually built. This was caused by scope changes, changes in the site boundaries, confusion about the changes in the site boundaries, and there was considerable back and forth. Wright was not obstinate or uncooperative, but was continually inspired not to relent in the boldness of his design by Solomon Guggenheim and Hiller von Rebe personally. But by 1952, Solomon was dead and Rebe ousted by the family. The new director, James Johnson Sweeney, did not like Wright or the design, but Wright felt he was compelled to complete the vision that he shared with Guggenheim. Construction started in 1956. Sweeney demanded more changes, and soon he and Wright were not on speaking terms. Solomon's nephew, Harry Guggenheim, had to act as the go-between. The building was completed in 1959, a few months after Frank Lloyd Wright's death. It was Wright's only museum, and yet he set the tone for all the museums to follow in the next generation, becoming personal, strong architectural statements by world-renowned architects. This has happened to the point where many times these museums are built with an almost unlimited budget, having become the Gothic cathedral of our age, perhaps even supplanting the corporate headquarters. As an example, there is the Guggenheim Bilbao, designed by Frank Gehry, Architecture Codex video number 11. And yes, this is the same Guggenheim Family Foundation. The form of the Guggenheim Museum is based on the fact that Wright took the vision of the museum as being for paintings very literally. And he also understood that most curators would like the visitors to see the show in a linear fashion, that is, one object after the other as the curator has set it up. Established museums, often housed in former Renaissance palaces, such as the Louvre or the Hermitage, had salons that were abutted in different patterns. This meant that one could go easily from one gallery to another and miss a room completely. To avoid this, he wanted his museum to be linear. That is, you would move from one piece of art to the next in the order it was designed to be seen. Because of the lack of space in New York City, ironically, his linear solution took the form of a spiral, a quarter mile in length, like what would happen if a snake coiled itself. Indeed, for most exhibitions, you would enter the museum, take the elevator to the top, and then walk down the slope spiral to take in the entire show. Since the museum was designed for modestly sized paintings, Wright had the very eccentric idea that the paintings needed to be viewed at the angle at which they were painted, the angle of an easel, so it would be seen as the artist had created it. For this reason, the exterior walls of the spiral are sloped at 7 degrees off vertical. There was also a ribbon of clerestory windows just above the paintings to bathe them in natural ambient light, again simulating the conditions under which they would be painted. But museum curators hate the UV rays in natural light as it damages artifacts. It is safe to say that many people resisted Wright's design, and they probably curse him today as they set up shows. This is why most installations at the Guggenheim need to block the paintings displayed so they are vertical, and sculpture is set up on podiums with angled bottoms. And the size of the art is limited because you can only step back so far to view larger pieces of art before you will tumble over the central railing. I have heard critics criticize the ramp, saying it is an uncomfortable way to view the art as you must stand with 1 foot higher than the other. But the ramp is only sloped 3 degrees, and so I think this is just critics whining about nothing. A handicap ramp is about a 5-degree slope if you need to make the comparison. By the way, requests for us to attempt to walk a slinky down the ramp of the Guggenheim Museum were not honored, but in a model test, the 3-degree slope did not appear to be sufficient for the slinky to go down, and it certainly could not negotiate the curve. It is that combination of the sloped concrete, cantilevered, helical ramps and the concrete sloped walls that are linked together through aggressive use of steel rebar that makes all the building elements work together and structurally stable. Rigid curvature gives building elements a structural bonus, and since the curvature at the Guggenheim occurs in perpendicular planes, the spiral is its own structure. This was pioneering architectural design and pushed the technology beyond what we could easily model today with advanced computers. I would occasionally argue with my mentor who did not like the building for all the reasons stated. For him, it failed the modernist motto, form ever follows function. But I think that's because Frank Lloyd Wright had defined the function so poorly, very narrow as being just for small paintings. But I maintain that the Guggenheim is a great museum, but not all museums need to be like it. And in fact, most museums should be different. There is room in this world for different kinds of museums, the same way there is room for different kinds of housing, schools, and other buildings, including different kinds of architectural styles. And in spite of all the criticism, the public loved the building. So once again, Frank Lloyd Wright had outfoxed architectural orthodoxy. My first encounter with the design and Frank Lloyd Wright was the 2-cent postage stamp that was issued in 1965. It depicted Frank in front of the Guggenheim Museum. And at the time, I thought that Wright was related to Wilbur and Orville and had something to do with early aviation. I was only 6 years old at the time. A few years later, my mother had taken us into Manhattan for our semi-annual city trek, the precursor to my urban spelunking. Often we took the train in, but this time she drove, and we happened to be heading north on 5th Avenue on our way home. And I recall my mother, who was not necessarily an architectural enthusiast, calling out, "Hey, I think that's the Guggenheim. Look, it's the Guggenheim Museum." And I remember thinking two things. First, Guggenheim's kind of a funny name, but also recalling the stamp and that image and realizing that I was seeing the Guggenheim Museum in person, I was thinking, wow. I'm Michael Molinelli, and this is Architecture CodeX.
It's a drowsy Sunday, good for a walk in the park. Enjoy the city before it gets too dark. Or do something cultural, whimsical on a lark. To stay at home would only be a crime. But there's no car to leave the New York grime. For Cold Spring trees we can only pine. But we can go to the Guggenheim. Temple at the Met, Egyptian space sublime. The natural history's got dinos in their prime. Course at the MoMA there's mannequins in slime. We can go to the Guggenheim. A week's work of meetings have kept me inside. Lord, get me home to you. I've cried, oh Lord, how I've tried. To be with you would simply be divine. We'll dress up nice and we'll go out to dine. I've given my love, now I'll give you some time. So why not go? Let's go. Come on, let's go. Come on, let's go to the Guggenheim.